Now, contemporary Europe, we all are more or less aware of what's been going on. So this issue has come up again in the light of these other crises. And so I don't want to suggest that this is the most important crisis, but it is an issue that just refuses to go away. And so I want to touch on the reasons for that. And the countries that have been at the forefront of the dispute, well, recently Greece, Poland, Japan, Germany, the United States, and Israel in various different ways. So I'll be touching on that. And I think it's also important to keep in mind this, that it is a very emotional term. Instinctively, it triggers an emotional response. And you see governments not immune from this, from these emotional types of arguments when they're trying to deal with this issue. And most recently, we had the Greek Prime Minister who didn't make any more friends when he said this in January 2015. He stated that he would be re-examining claims. Now this was not surprisingly met by a response by Sigmar Gabriel, who said it was dumb for Greece to try and do this, to link the war issue with the current debt talks. Over a month after that, the president at the time, Joachim Gauck, said that Germany does have a historical responsibility, should examine it. Now, in the summer of the same year, after the Greek referendum, the Japanese company Mitsubishi Motors apologized for using US POWs as slaves in their factories. And this is the latest development and ongoing over almost 25 years of legal battles from the United States and from the surviving POWs against Japan and these Japanese companies. Now it is important to note this differentiation here. In this case it's compensation, it's not reparations. The difference being a payment from a company or government to an individual as opposed to a payment between governments. But nonetheless, representing that kind of a link between the past and the present. And about 6 months later, the Law and Justice Party MPs of this party in Poland stated that Germany couldn't criticize the legislation they were passing because the bill for World War II had not yet been paid. The following summer, the Greek government again starts preparing estimates for what they believe are still owed from the Second World War and World War I, interestingly. And this is followed most recently up to about a month ago, saying that the Polish government stating again that they're preparing new rounds of estimates for what they believe Germany owes them. And the highest estimates reaching about €1 trillion. So these are not insignificant amounts. And so again, what are then the legal and historical bases for these claims? You know, why do they just keep coming up? Why aren't they going away? Well, to deal with that, we do have to go back to the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles, which did state this, that cash reparations would be paid by Germany. And in 1921, the total cost of these reparations was set at 132 billion marks, and I just put the equivalent just to give a point of reference for today. Now, these amounts, though, were quite huge. They were more or less unmanageable for the Weimar government. It necessitated a couple of other agreements. The first was the Dawes Plan. And what it did is it placed Germany's currency back on the gold standard in an attempt to try and stabilize the economy and promote growth. But what it actually did is it allowed the Weimar government to go on a borrowing binge and borrowed far beyond its means and created another debt crisis. Necessitated another plan, the Young Plan, which made it more difficult for people to lend to Germany. The ensuing deflation and recession, however, we know the effects. The hyperinflation that was created, it created political and social chaos and resulted in the election of Adolf Hitler. And Hitler repudiates all of these debts in the 1930s. And it leaves foreign banks and governments holding them. And so we have an interesting period from the mid-1930s to the mid-1940s, where these debts are still on the books. Now, after World War II, there are a number of conferences that will deal with reparations. And I would like to add in here, in 1947, the Moscow Council of Foreign Ministers. So at Yalta, they do make a decision that there will be reparations collected from Germany. And also importantly, the Soviets secure a concession from the British and the Americans that it's the communist government in Poland, not the Polish government in exile, that will be the official government of Poland. And that's a big compromise. They meet again at Potsdam, and they decide that reparations from other Axis members will be evaluated separately from Germany. So there's not going to be a package deal. Each one will have to negotiate its own settlement. And they also decide that they're going to found an agency to administer the distribution of reparations, and it's the IARA. And just before the conference ends, the USSR presents its first estimate of reparations, and they say that Germany should pay 320 billion pre-war US dollars, equivalent to roughly 5.3 trillion today. And this is an incredibly high amount. It's dismissed almost immediately as being completely unreasonable. So the Inter-Allied Reparations Agency meets in Paris the same year, and they make a decision on what will constitute reparations. And they also decide how much each country will get of a to-be-determined pool. And this is very important as well to keep in mind, because what they decide, the most important thing is that reparations from Germany will be non-monetary. And they also divide that which will be collected between A and B assets, so fixed and movable industrial products. So what does that mean? Category A, things like blast furnaces and factories, especially steel factories, very, very important for especially the French and the Belgians. And then ships and rail cars, okay, for example. Now, just as a side note as well, non-monetary gold was included in this agreement, but it was administered separately. It wasn't considered part of reparations, it was its own category. Now, much of that, not surprisingly, made its way into Switzerland. And then there were huge fights with the Swiss, so between the Americans, the British, and the Swiss to try and recover this gold. The committee that was established to recover non-monetary gold ceased operations in 2010 and estimates that they recovered about 65% of the personal gold that was looted during the Second World War. And that's just for a little bit of context, that this gold is not considered part of reparations, okay? But very importantly as well at Paris, this is an agreement that they come to. They decide that whatever they determine will be the amount that Germany will pay or will give. The USSR will get 25% of that. And they also afford to the Soviet Union an extra right of 10% of industrial goods from the Allied occupied zones of Germany in the future. And they make a change in policy where they decide that the countries that had been most devastated will be compensated less than those which have contributed most to the war effort. It's an important switch that occurs at Paris. And so the following table is not really that surprising. You see the amounts that are claimed. And it's also important to note who is absent from this table. Poland is not included. Yugoslavia is included. Czechoslovakia is included because at the time it's still not a communist government. They still have a democratic government in place. Well, we know that will change within the next couple of months. But you can also see the amounts. So, the next conference is the Paris Peace Conference, where the amounts will finally be set. They have the pool, they have the percentages that each country is supposedly awarded. And the other members of the Axis signed separate peace and reparation treaties with the Allies. And most importantly as well, these countries assign cash agreements. So Italy, Bulgaria, Hungary, Finland pay. They don't give industrial goods. It's an important contrast to what is agreed with Germany. The pool of reparations from Germany is set at 23 billion pre-war US dollars in goods. So now we're going to talk about Greece specifically. So what does this mean? Well, what they estimate, the damage done to Greece as a result of the occupation is around 7 billion pre-war US dollars. And I'm sorry, this is 122 billion today, not trillion. Okay, that's a little typo, just to keep that in mind. 122 billion today. Now, this amount is never used as a basis to calculate what Greece should get. It was simply a starting point to try and assess the damage and what goods should Greece get. You know, and so based on the percentages, Greece is awarded 4.3% category B, so movable products, and 2.7% category A, and translated into dollars, roughly 1.5 billion. So about a fifth of the total damage is what they're awarded at Paris. Now, historian Hagen Fleischer has found that Greece received somewhere between 25 and 80 million US dollars in reparations until 1947. It's very tough to narrow it down more than that because the goods that they're talking about are often, if they were there, were pre-war ships or pre-war factories, it's very difficult to put a stable dollar value on that. So that's why there's a large spread. But at its greatest extent, about 80 million. So about a tenth of what it was awarded at Paris it received. And an interesting comparison is that it does receive 100 million US dollars from Italy in reparations and 45 million from Bulgaria, the other occupying countries. Now, the status of reparations is complicated by this. In 1946, where the chief administrator of the western occupied zones of Germany orders the delivery of reparations suspended, which takes place incrementally up to the end of 1947. And this is in response to a number of things, but especially to what the Soviets are doing in East Germany. They're devastating it, pulling everything out and shipping it to the Soviet Union. And they're also doing the same in Austria. So there's a huge economic impact. And also with their drawing rights in the West, as per the Potsdam Agreement, that which West Germany is producing is being taken. And so the Americans are finding that West Germany and themselves, through their occupation costs, are financing the reconstruction of the Soviet Union at a time when relations between the Soviet Union and the United States are getting worse and worse. So they suspend reparations. And as a part of context as well, the Marshall Plan is underway, which is another reason that reparations are suspended. They know this is on the horizon. And a key part of the Marshall Plan is that it wipes out the Nazi government debt. By some estimations, the debt had reached 90% of its 1938 GDP, so about 300 billion pre-war US dollars, and the European Recovery Program wipes that out. So West Germany is able to start with a clean slate. Now, to deal with these issues, the Soviet Union is quite upset at the canceling of reparations. At the same time, the United States introduces a new currency. They introduced the Deutschmark as a way to try and get the currency, get the economy going. And this causes problems for the Soviet Union. They try to address this at the Council of Foreign Ministers. They're unable to come to an agreement. And in a move to try and reduce administrative costs, the United States and the UK unify their zones of occupation, and the Soviets, in response, increased the isolation of East Germany. And so it really does foreshadow the actual physical division that's coming. And then very shortly after, the Benelux as well are extremely concerned over the deliveries, the cancellation of the deliveries of reparations, because a lot of their post-war economic planning had been based on the assumption that they'd be receiving a number of goods from Germany. The French are especially concerned with the steel factories, because the key point, a key part of French post-war planning is a need to control German steel production so that they can't make war again. And it's a huge fear, psychologically, in the government and the general population, that that something has to be done about German coal and steel. And they approach the British. They know the British have a special relationship, have the ear of the United States. They approach the British, and the British inform them, well, the United States is no longer in favor of pursuing reparations or dismantlement at this particular point in time. And so Robert Schumann replies, well, we're interested not only as an occupier of Germany, but also just in the simple context of reparations to find out what is going on with these factories. And one of the key, because they hadn't received official notice from the Americans, so there's a lot of fears, there's a lot of misinformation or a lack of concrete information going around in these governments as well. And a key factor is the Hamborne Steel Factory, which had been listed for dismantling, which would now be exempt. And so he says, well, the effect is doubled. Not only are we being denied our reparations, but it's providing the capacity for Germany potentially to rearm again in the future. Very, very politically sensitive in France. And it contributes directly to a unifying position of the Western European powers. The British try and use this to get the Benelux and the French closer together, to say, well, we can't allow this issue of reparations to get the Germans to divide a wedge between us. We have to find a common position. And so they agreed to present a common position in Washington. And it's a key point in the foundation of the European Union, because it leads directly to the control of steel production and the declaration of the Schumann Plan, which proposes a high authority for coal and steel production. So coal and steel production, will, if the French can't control it, well, then neither will the Germans. It will be placed under a high authority beyond the control of one national government. And it's formalized by the European Coal and Steel Community being founded, the Treaty of Paris, in 1951. Now, there's many things in reference to reparations taking place simultaneously. It's a rapid succession of events because in 1949, the first offer of German reparations is made to Israel, which is rejected. It's followed up 3 years later by a substantial offer which the Israeli government accepts. And then immediately after this offer, we have the London Agreement, and formerly known as the London Agreement on German External Debt. And it's signed by these countries, and again, notice who is absent. Poland is not represented. At this point, the only communist country that's represented is Yugoslavia. Now, the terms that are agreed is that, well, West Germany will honor the outstanding World War I and interwar debt that Hitler had repudiated. And in return for recognizing that, it'll be cut by 50% and payable only when Germany runs a trade surplus. So it's an excellent offer for Germany. It's also a favorable one for the signatories because, well, they have an incentive to buy German goods. They get re-entry of Germany into the Western European economy. And it is a huge contribution to the so-called Wirtschaftswunder. You know, this agreement combined with the European Recovery Program really propels Germany forward. And it also, in relation to World War II reparations, it states that no claims will be considered until German reunification. And this is important because it's also, at that time, considered that this reunification will be a very long way off. So it's a safe way to postpone this. Allow Germany to get back on its feet. Let's leave the Second World War behind. There's a lot of fatigue with this issue in the Second World War in the United States as well. They want an agreement to move forward, to deal with the Cold War. So it is also a temporal solution to the problems, just a way to just leave these things behind for the time being. And it's also important to note that in 1954, the Soviets, depending on the perspective, either force, urge, or recommend that the Poles renounce any future claims. And the Polish government does. It signs an agreement with the Federal Republic renouncing any claims to reparations. And so for almost 6 years, the issue of reparations remains closed. Until something which has become known as the Merton Affair. This is an image of Merton in the Greek courtroom. He was the Wehrmacht administrator of Thessaloniki from 1942 to 1944. He profited personally from the extermination of the Jews, among other things, by making them pay for their tickets to Auschwitz. He fled Greece and was apprehended by the United States in 1945. And under the Potsdam Agreement, those accused of committing war crimes were to be returned to the countries in which they had allegedly committed them. However, a wartime collaborator, a Greek named General Ypsilantis, convinces the Americans that Mertens was not a criminal, and actually he is released and spends the next 11 years in Germany amassing a small fortune. And in 1957, he's called as a witness in Greece to a former colleague of his who is on trial for war crimes. And Merton contacts the German embassy in Athens to see if there are any outstanding warrants. He's assured there are none, so he goes to Greece. And when he's in the courtroom, the prosecutor recognizes him and is shocked and leaves the courtroom, draws up an arrest warrant, comes back, gives it to the bailiff, and the bailiff arrests Merton on the spot. Now, this enrages Adenauer. Adenauer is quoted as saying this is a matter of politics, not justice. He contacts Prime Minister Karamanlis and says that this will severely damage Greek and German economic relations. And Karamanlis says, well, don't worry. No matter what happens, I'll pardon Merton and send him back to Germany, which is exactly what takes place. 2 years later, Mertens is sent back to Germany. The years he spent are credited to his pension. He is never put on trial for war crimes again, and this is why it's important for reparations. Because the event triggers such publicity that East Germany offers reparations to Greece as compensation. And for sure, it's to secure international recognition and to embarrass the Federal Republic. It's done at the urging of the Soviet Union. The Federal Republic had threatened to cut off any diplomatic relations with any country that recognized the Democratic Republic. The United States urges very forcefully that Greece should very much reconsider accepting this offer, which it does. And what we know now as well is that there was already an agreement being negotiated behind the scenes. And this is the result. The Federal Republic makes a voluntary payment, what they called ex gratia, of 115 million marks to Greece. for the government to distribute to victims of National Socialism. Now afterwards, from 1960 to 1990, well, there are some developments. In 1972, an arbitral tribunal for the agreement on German external debt, it's foreseen in the London Debt Agreement, meets to deal with the sinking of Greek merchant ships and other Greek property that was destroyed while Greece was neutral during the First World War. And as per the London Debt Agreement, these property damages are not considered part of the rest of World War I reparations, which were covered by the London Debt Agreement, so they had to be resolved through negotiation. And that's important to keep in mind. What it rules is that the German government is under an obligation to enter into negotiations, the course of which the parties are obliged to make every reasonable effort to reach an agreement with respect to the settlement of the claims in dispute. So this is significant just because the London Agreement was very specific in terms of which debts were covered, which were exempted, and which were not, which were postponed, and which had to be dealt with through negotiation. So World War I reparations were covered, and Weimar debt was covered. But because Greece was neutral, those debts were not. World War II reparations were postponed simply. And I'll just ask you to keep that in mind, because this will come back. And one of the witnesses that's called in 1972, who was one of the head of the representatives of the German delegation in London in 1953, states this: "For the purpose of the London Conference was not to settle debts, but simply, if possible, to ascertain their volume and to bring the creditors and debtors together to try and find a solution, or a framework through which a solution could be found." And the consistent Federal Republic policy throughout this time is this: that only a reunited Germany can assess World War II claims for reparations. But as reunification nears, we have the documents from the embassies that the West German government sent out guidelines for how their embassies should deal with inquiries about reparations. And reunification takes place on September 12, 1990 with the 2+4 treaty. And obviously it recognizes the reunited German state, its ability to enter into treaties, its current borders, the composition of its armed forces. But importantly, it does not mention at all World War II reparations. And neither Greece nor Poland signed, nor does anyone else. But it's just important because since this treaty was signed, West Germany says reparations are closed. Or the reunited Germany says reparations are closed. If countries wanted to press a claim, this was their chance to do so, and they didn't. And it would seem to be a tenuous legal position to hold, based on my consultation with some lawyers that have dealt with this issue. However, there are payments. Now, most of these are compensation. In 1992, reunited Germany does pay Poland 4.7 billion zloty, about 500 million marks in compensation, again, for the government to pay out to victims of National Socialism. And Germany has accepted individual claims. It's established a number of funds to deal with violations. In 1995, Germany negotiated an agreement with the United States to set up a fund to compensate victims who were U.S. citizens at the time of their persecution. It also sets up a large fund which has been paid out to over 800,000 claimants for crimes who were used as forced laborers. So Germany has been very willing and able to create funds for compensation. And in reference to World War I, well, in 2010 it did make the last payment on what was left of its outstanding World War I debt. Now, I think there are also some misconceptions on the part of the Greek claim that it is something that just came up recently. That is not the case. Tsipras, certainly his timing was unfortunate, and some may call it incompetent timing. But it wasn't the first. 2013, the previous center-right government was preparing estimates, did approach the German government to inquire about the possibility of investigating this further. In 2003, the Semitis government made claims. And in 1997, the first Distamo decision was issued in Greece by the Supreme Court, which accepted victims' claims, and the court issued an order to confiscate German property in Greece in compensation. This was rejected by the German Foreign Ministry, so the Greek claimants took the case to Italy. The Italian courts upheld the Greek decision, But then Germany intervened. The case went to the International Court of Justice, where the ICJ ruled that state immunity prohibited any such claims from proceeding any further. But it was a long-standing legal battle. And currently, there's the issue of the forced loan. Now, what was the forced loan? And why is it important? Well, it was this. It was a 0% loan extracted by the Wehrmacht from the National Bank of Greece to pay the costs of the occupation. Now, for years, the National Bank of Greece was saying that it had this debt on its books. And it wasn't taken very seriously until Hagen Fleischer found this document. He found, it's a Wehrmacht document that states the outstanding amount of the loan just before the German withdrawal of 476 million Reichsmarks. And it also shows that the Wehrmacht had made payments on this loan prior to leaving Greece. And it gets tricky, because these are the values. At the time, about 228 million US dollars, adjusted for inflation, 7 to 11 billion euros today, outstanding. And if an interest rate, which is standard for the period from the 1950s to the present, of anywhere from 3 to 6%, the amount could be huge. But it's clear that this loan is not covered by the London Debt Agreement, so it has to be solved through negotiation. It's not established, it wasn't provided for in the settlement that's reached. It's not considered World War II reparations, or obviously interwar debt. There is a contrary view, because another German historian has said that he hasn't found any evidence of this forced loan in existence. He hasn't found any payments from Greece to Germany. So for him, the loan doesn't exist. But it is countered again by Hagen Fleischer, who simply says this: if this were the case, then why would the Wehrmacht provide a receipt showing payments? And it also doesn't take into account how the Nazi state operated, because it's not surprising that the Ministry of Finance didn't have these documents, since the state operated where branches were very independent of one another. So this is an ongoing debate between these two historians, and we will see if any further evidence is uncovered. Generally, the position of Fleischer is a bit stronger because it's supported by this document, but we'll see. So it's just an ongoing issue to keep our eyes open for. So how can we resolve these issues? Well, what I've tried to do, and through the paper that this presentation is based on, is this: to go back to the beginning, to see, well, what is the basis? And to really be clear on what was intended for World War II reparations. You know, the format was established, what were reparations, but this is also extremely important, is did any of these agreements give the right to third parties to dismiss the claims of the quote-unquote smaller allies? Because certainly the case of Poland today is that. They're saying the Soviet Union did not have the right to force our government to relinquish our claims. And the role of the United States in dismissing reparations is well documented as well. And also, my position and the position of Professor Fleischer is this: well, at least in the case of Greece, is focus on the forced loan. Because it's an issue that can be examined more or less free of the emotional connotation of reparations. It can be looked at purely as an unpaid debt. And like the World War I debt examined in 1972, the forced loan is not covered by the London Agreement. It has to be solved by negotiation. And so if you'll permit me just to read what the court said at the time, what the tribunal said at the time about negotiation. It says, negotiations is not without legal consequences. It means that both sides would make an effort, in good faith, to bring about a mutually satisfactory solution by way of compromise, even if that meant the relinquishment of strongly held positions earlier taken. It implies a willingness, for the purpose of negotiation, to abandon earlier positions and to meet the other side part way. The language of the agreement cannot be construed to mean that either side intends to adhere to its previous stand and to insist upon the complete capitulation of the other side. Such a concept would be inconsistent with the term negotiation. It would be the very opposite of what is intended. An undertaking to negotiate involves an understanding to deal with the other side with a view to coming to terms. The desirability of such a positive outcome is necessarily much greater in relationships between states than between individuals, if for no other reason than the stakes are infinitely higher. when states have solemnly undertaken to resolve their differences and then fail to do so, incalculable harm can follow. The need for a peaceful solution of differences between states is so great and so essential that the well-being of the community of nations, that when disputants have reached a point of signifying their agreement to negotiate an outstanding dispute, the subsequent negotiations normally ought to lead to a satisfactory and equitable result. And so I don't want to say that the lack of resolution to this issue could contribute to a war in Europe, but certainly it's a stressor. And certainly it indicates the lack of a willingness of dialogue, certainly a lack of a willingness to be flexible to meet the other side. And as we know with European history, sparks can ignite certain blazes.